Good evening. Hello, everyone. So I'm Dan Winter, as you know, fractalfield.com, and I'm here with Dave from Generation Z.
Thank you so much, sir, for returning once again. Your lectures are extremely appreciated, and we are very, very humbled and honored to have you back.
Well, thank you. And it's a synergy way to reach a very interested audience. And the first two presentations, this is the third in the series, have reached a wide audience. And today, today's conversation is entitled Nuclear Karma, Implosive Physics Key, Turning ET History Inside Out. And the idea here is that we want to use the physics of radiation, radiation poisoning, and solutions to radioactivity as an instructional principle to see that if we understood that, we understand almost all of the key points in the extraterrestrial history of Earth and the key points limiting the evolution of the human consciousness into both how to take memory through death and into stargates and portals and all the fun stuff. So our evolution kind of depends on understanding this physics, in my view. And this physics I'm referring to specifically is the kind of centripetal or implosive, we say implosive capacitance or implosive charge, think Ark of the Covenant. That centripetal implosive charge measurably reduces radioactivity. And we're going to talk about examples of that, et cetera. And so when you create a centripetal implosive or fractal electric field, it is the opposite of fission, the opposite of radioactivity. It is fusion and not fission. And if we understood why anything is centripetal, we get the key to the release from the nightmare of ET parasitic history of Earth. And telling those stories and reviewing those themes, illustrating the fractal physics principle of how we are released from the messy karma of ET history by understanding the core physics. Again, the core physics being the reason no physicist on this planet apparently knows why an object falls to the ground. NASA, Stephen Hawking, Einstein. No, they do not know. The reason they do not know is because they do not know why anything is centripetal electrically. Life force is centripetal electrically. Gravity is centripetal electrically. Electronegativity, an electron is centripetal electrically. Focused human attention is centripetal electrically. But yet if physics cannot understand the pure principle, the pure fractal principle of what makes an electric field implosive or centripetal, then we're locked in to the nightmare of a parasitic ET history. So we wanted to tell some of those stories to bring that lesson home. That's the story to the Maury of tonight's conversation. So the first thing I want to do, now let's see if can you enable screen sharing, Dave? Apparently,
oh, not a problem. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. When I clicked on screen, so I wanted to first share that outline. Let's see if it works now.
Should be now.
Okay. Yes. Here we go. Yes. There we go. Whiteboard. Okay. So I'm going to go to Neil. This document is called Nuclear Karma. And that's the theme. Every time we tell a piece of this story, we're going to say, like Eisenhower, we're going to say, and he had nuclear karma. The planet Earth has nuclear karma. So today is about instant karma. That is nuclear karma. So this is the outline. Are you seeing the outline there?
Yes.
Text. Yep. Okay. So just briefly, in terms of, you say you're going to say it, and then you say it, and then say you said it. This is the say you're going to say it abstract, which is, this is an ET Races, Planets, and Technology online conference webinar, which I have planned for Portal to Ascension conference on ET Races and Planets, planned for March 26. And you are invited, portaltoascension.com, portaltoascension.org, my old friend Neil. And tonight's conversation is a warm-up for that story, and it's also to enable us to get more in-depth into the subject. So, and remember, the article, which is the summary of all these reviews of extraterrestrial history of Earth, is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, as you know. So after losing to the Nazis, because of their plasma vortex gravity tech, Eisenhower ended up in treaty with the worst parasite greys whom Alain de Danaan calls the Nebu, precisely because he thought he could not give up his nukes, nuclear karma. The history of nukes on our planet notably linked to Anunnaki needing nukes to penetrate the Van Allen belt, and we're going to explain. The Ark was their implosive capacitor container for those nukes, called Plague of Azoth in the Bible, which literally means radiation poisoning. They had nuclear karma. The early Federation Andromedan installed quarantine signal generators in the artificial hollow metal moon from the Arcturians, actually, did so by amping, there was a frequency generator there, they call it frequency quarantine, by amping the Van Allen belts, thus trapping, they thought, the bad guys, Nebu, here. But that was temporary until they had stargates and portals, which are broad spectral phase conjugate longitudinal interferometry nodes, basically places where charge implosion creates the acceleration down the wormholes. Now, the fact is, once we understand this physics of implosive capacitance, we actually begin to understand not just stargates and portals releasing us from quarantine, but also we understand exactly the electrical physics of successful death. So until physics can teach this physics of action at a distance, that is travel down the wormhole, which Einstein incorrectly called spooky, we are unwittingly stuck here with the quarantine, even though the moon generators are pretty much decayed now. For physics, and this is conventional physics on this planet, when they talk about action at a distance, they call that Einstein-Rosen-Bridge wormholes, action at a distance, the result of entanglement. But see, they don't know that entanglement perfected is what phase conjugation is, which is how you create longitudinal wormholes, interferometry. So for physics to call Einstein-Bridge wormholes action at a distance is just a word band-aid, barely concealing stark ignorance. So when physics says, well, action at a distance due to entanglement, then what they're saying is we don't have a clue. And it's, I say, rather like a biologist smugly saying, oh, we know how birds navigate. We call that instinct. When in fact, the word instinct was their word for we don't have a clue. So the magnetic lines that the birds navigate are plasma intelligence. And plasma intelligence inhabits the wormhole. Think Deep Space Nine. So until physics can teach action at a distance, entanglement, embedding, perfected, is precisely the problem phase conjugation fractality, longitudinal coherence, plasma projection solves. Not only does this untrap our species from primitive propulsion by dinosaur farts, plasma projection is not just stargates and portals, but really the only way through death electrically, when you understand that charge implosion is how successful death happens. It's a compression success. It's a black hole. We have the evidence. So finally, our electrical engineering universities will teach how the well-aimed charge stream squirt gun, Giza Pyramid, is a resurrection machine for star inhabiting. Our kids must become sun gods, interstellar plasma intelligence like the Nine, which is the conclusion to our story today. And that's why Enki's Kadistu, think Caduceus, seeders are back here, Elena Danaan's Ganymede meetings, etc., to witness graduation from kindergarten. Like, can we get out of the quarantine? Can we enter the stargates? Can we become an interstellar species? We must understand the nuclear karma key. So now that's the, and I'm going to stop the screen share. Okay, so that was the introductory abstract of today's conversation. So let's try to take this very gently now. Let's try to take this sort of one thought at a time. So first of all, the philosophy of what is the solution to nuclear karma. What is the philosophy? The essential principle, obviously, nuclear problems most often are caused by fission and not fusion. It's well understood that if we had fusion energy, we wouldn't have the mess, which is fission energy. Fission is they take it apart. Fusion is they put it together, which is literally explosion versus implosion, which is literally fractality versus the opposite. And so understanding that electrically is the key to releasing us from our stuck in a small planet a long way from downtown. Okay, so here are some examples to try to understand that. I knew Bruce Cathy fairly well, harmonic 33, did a lot of work on Earth grid engineering, measured the harmonics of the speed of light, predicting the nodal array on the Earth grid, the famous dodecaecosa from Anti-Gravity in the World Grid back in Higgins. And he also then measured the fact that and governments tried to hide this for years, but it's true that nuclear critical mass changes if the device is on an Earth grid, quote unquote, sacred site or ley line cross on the dodecaecosa Earth grid. On those wave nodes, nuclear critical mass is significantly different. Of course, knowing that is a threat to national security, but it's also the only way to understand consciousness. So hello, let's understand the physics. The reason that nuclear critical mass, you need to make actually different calculations if your nuclear device is on a magnetic node, because nuclear critical mass is implosion. In fact, the first nuclear devices were named implosion because the phonon shock wave from the explosive trigger devices in a dodecaecosa around Fat Boy, the original, they were sending a shock wave to create a compression wave of sufficient inertia to center, literally implosion, to create nuclear critical mass. That's why they call the first nuclear devices were named for implosion. So the point is that the longitudinal or compressional component of the electromagnetic array, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional, is the one that, when it arrives from opposite directions in symmetry, creates a squeezing effect. And the squeezing effect is that which creates the implosion, the centripetal force at center at the nucleus, literally. So thinking in electrical terms, now you can begin to understand what we wish to discuss this evening. The component of the EMF, electromagnetic pulse shock wave from a nuclear event, the component that is both powerful and dangerous, is the longitudinal or compressional component of the nuclear electromagnetic pulse. For example, the up and down component of the electromagnetic wave, called transverse, when that hits the nucleus, it's only going up and down. It doesn't create implosive compression. But the component of the electromagnetic radiation that does create the big squeeze, that is the compressional or longitudinal component of the electromagnetic wave. Now remember, Tom Bearden proved that longitudinal interferometry is gravity waves. And by the way, you want to convey the longitudinal component of the sun via a copper plate into your basement. You can grow plants perfectly in an absolutely dark basement using the longitudinal component of the sun. So longitudinal component is the fun stuff. And if you learn to create a coherent aura propagating longitudinally, that's when you can lucid dream and you can die well. That's when your aura is the Ba from the Ka, et cetera, et cetera. It's the rainbow light body, all those fun terms. That's why, since phase conjugate Therify.net plasma measurably and replicably helps trigger lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming means the aura has done compression accurate enough to radiate a longitudinal EMF, the Ba from the Ka, and that coherent component of your light body is what enables you to die well, to lucid dream, and to take memory through death. So understanding the relationship, why nuclear events create a mess in the longitudinal array, is key to understanding why the ETs were so concerned when the humans got nukes. Remember, the ETs showed up just after the humans got nukes. Roswell showed up just next to where the humans had their nukes. Remember, Ancient Alien series documented when the UFOs showed up over all the US nuclear missile silos, and the ETs proved, and this was testimony in front of Congress, the ETs proved they could switch off the nukes in the nuclear silo. Why were all the ETs so deeply concerned about our nukes? This is called, we got nuclear karma. And so, well, because that compressional component into the longitudinal array, which in the case of a nuclear device is profoundly disruptive, literally, at the end of this lecture, we're going to explain how advanced plasma intelligence, for example, the 9, Atun, think Andrei Puharich and the Ganymede meetings and, the story about the 9, Deep Space Nine. Well, these are very advanced plasma intelligent beings. These are who we would like to grow up to become. But guess what? We don't get to grow up and become these advanced plasma intelligence beings if we keep messing with the longitudinal array coherence, the nukes. That's our nuclear karma. So example 1 was Ruth Cathy. Example 2 is the second time I was in Keshe's living room in Italy by the lake there, and I had Europe's leading cold fusion physicist, Jean-Paul, with me, and we're sitting with Keshe there, who's famous for these nano device technology. And by the way, Keshe is fairly competent as a nuclear engineer. By interview, I know that, but electrically, sorry. But we were there, so literally the phone rings and it's TEPCO in Japan, just after Japan had their nuclear meltdown from the tsunami, telling Keshe to say, oh, we just tested these nanomaterials. And by the way, they reduce radioactivity. I mean, I was there when he took the phone call. Now, why would an array of thin nanomaterials, hint, phase conjugators, think Buckminster fullerene, think carbon nano, think implosive capacitance. So a thin film of nanomaterials creates an electric field that reduces radioactivity, a solution to nuclear karma. So the other thing, I just wanted to tell a little story, since we're moving toward Andrei Puharich, whom I knew very well and who really started the story of the 9 when he channeled Tom Atun. Later he learned that was Enki and the 9, which later then Phyllis Schlemmer taught Roddenberry, and that was Deep Space Nine. And they were an advanced plasma intelligence being. You can read all about it at goldenmean.info/whale dreamers. So I was with Puharich then, and Puharich had just adopted Uri Geller. and Uri Geller had just finished measuring something. You know what it was? Uri Geller measured the fact that focused human attention reduces radioactivity. It was famous that Bill Tiller measured the fact that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. That's well known in the book Conscious Acts of Creation by Bill Tiller, and we talk about it many times. We explained the physics of why focused human attention causes electric fields to compress, as has been measured many ways by Bill Tiller. The reason is because the only physics of consciousness that actually describes well is implosive plasma vortex. For the same reason that kids who see without their eyes say, oh yes, I'm looking through a plasma tunnel, a vortex, a tornado inside my head with they're blindfolded, and they can see through a tornado that has an eyeball. So the physics of consciousness is an imploding plasma vortex tornado. That's what it is. And it stands to reason. Obviously, if that's the reason focused human attention is electrically centripetal, anything that's electrically centripetal is going to reduce radiation because it's the opposite of radiation by definition. So that was cool. So that was the third example. We got Cathy, Keshe, and Geller, and View Puharich in the 9. So that introduces the ET part of our story. So what we want to say here now is that if we understand that nuclear karma is the key turning points in almost every branch of our major ET history, we can begin to turn that inside out. Now, you know what I mean by turning it inside out is, here is the electron shell symmetry. This is the Star Mother kit of gold and noble gases, which are phase conjugate implosive atoms. And I wrote the equation to prove this is the structure of hydrogen as well. So this completed fractal electron valence symmetry, the DF subshells, which is the outer valence electrons of every noble gas and platinum group metal, is dodecaecosa, 5-10 spin pair, 10-14 electrons. That's what the DF. So completing the valence electron symmetries shells makes implosion, which is the opposite of radioactivity. So these are called phase conjugators. They are implosive. It's the physics of projective powder, the philosopher's stone, the physics of alchemy. So the understanding how these monatomic gold, for example, create that implosion is also key to ET history. For example, when Sitchin says the reason they genetically engineered humans to be gold miners, Adam and Eve at Takadama, was because they used the gold, later called Mana Ormes, the spice, to repair the home atmosphere. Well, in fact, repairing home atmosphere is more than metaphor for restoring fractality to make the atmosphere electrically centripetal. Of course, then later we learn, oh, they were eating the gold. But so ET history is fraught with this description, this discovery of what creates centripetal charge. And remember, we have said many times that when the Anunnaki said, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord, mistranslated, I will raise an altar unto the Lord. It was more correct. I will raise an age-reversing implosive phase conjugate electric field that will eliminate aging. That's what they meant when they said, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord, which is a description of the implosive capacitance of things like dolmen and pyramid. And literally, the plasma tube on the wall of the pyramid is the logo for Therify.net for the same reason, because that was their age rejuvenation technology, the opposite of nuclear karma. So the Anunnaki, we want to tell the piece of their story that has to do with nuclear karma. and that is, remember, recently we read from Elena Danaan, and she's a friend, and I think she's right, that the Anunnaki were not the same as the Draco, but they were also parasitic-like, and they, in fact, were based in the Orion group, also like the Nebu and the Gray. And if you read Anton Parks, that kind of fits, because although Enki, Abra, Abraham, Osiris, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, probably Zoroaster, all these are names for Enki, Odin, probably names for Enki, most of them. But Enki himself wanted his genetic engineering. Remember, he was named Nudimud, the cloner, because that was his job, cloning, that he wanted his clones, the human Takadama, to be more than slaves and snack food. But his family only wanted slaves and snack food. That's it. And that fits Elena Danaan's description of the primarily parasitic Anunnaki from Orion. And so this is the Enlil Enki Anu story. And it fits then where we're going to go with this was what is their nuclear karma. So depending on which source you believe, and I recommend the sources quoted at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, which would be both the Andromedan version of the story and the Pleiadian version of the story, which fit together, which also fits Anton Parks' version of the story. Basically, everyone agrees. So the story is that, well, one part of the story is that the Anunnaki were such navigation klutzes that in order to get through the asteroid and Van Allen belt, they needed their nukes. and they carried their nukes in a device that was a technology that they were too much klutzes to put together. But the Ark of the Covenant was an implosive capacitor, remember, gold in a golden ratio, and acacia wood, super high dielectric. So Ark of the Covenant, implosive capacitor, which could contain the nukes, later called Plague of Azoth, because it's electrically centripetal. And they needed their nukes to get here. Now, this is going to become part of the story later when we realize the bigger picture of this story is that the Anunnaki and their partners in crime, or the other bad guys, so to speak, which would be called the Uru, or the ancient Draco, which Elena Danaan and the Secret Space Program people call the Siakar, which is basically the royal class of the Draco Uru. When they were parasitically controlling the Earth, both the Draco and the Anunnaki, they were being chased. And this is important. And you can read this part of the story if you click on the Interstellar Mediator, Galactic History and History of the Moon story, again at Fusion in the Blood. And you can read this in great detail. But the short summary is the Draco, remember, had blown up a huge sector of the Lyra Vega humanoids, and subsequently the Draco were winning in what were called the Wars of Expansion. They were called the Orion Wars, and they were sometimes called the Oxygen Wars. The reason they're called the Oxygen Wars because if oxygen is winning on a planet, that means the Dracos are losing because the oxygen is a poison to them. So this is if you want to get the Draco shapeshifters out of your Senate, pump in oxygen and moisture because it's a poison. It's actually quite simple. Now, supposedly, Elena Danaan is saying the Galactic Federation has now booted out the Nebu and Draco and the Greys of the solar system, actually. And I think they're probably right. But there's still a lot of residue, as he said. It's still like you got the tick out of your arm. But anywho, so during those wars of expansion, there was a diaspora of humanoids, and the humanoids have tens of thousands of humanoid cultures in our galactic quadrant alone. It's clear. Both the Pleiadians, the Andromedans, they all agree on this. And the reason they chased them to Earth is very instructive. First of all, Earth was a DNA genetic diversity library. That's why that's our ticket. We're a genetic diversity library. Our technology is crap, but our genetic diversity, this is priceless. So anyway, they chased the Draco and the Anunnaki here, and it was a female-dominated Pleiadian Tegatan, which is why, as we said, that Draco and Anunnaki started most every religion of Earth with the fear of women, because guess who they were afraid of? And this is a big part of where the Orion Wars of Expansion almost destroyed our solar system. And humans need to understand this story. It's very important, actually. And it is nuclear karma. So the Galactic Federation, the fleet, arrived here, because remember, after millennia, the humanoids had regained the strength to basically resist the Draco, the Uru, and the Anunnaki, whom the Tegatan Pleiadians also call reptilians. Remember, Enki looked like a frog. His face was green. That's why every face of Osiris, Enki in Egypt is green. And Enki Thoth started Thule, which is the name for the royal line of Egypt, Thutmose, and the name for Atlantis, Thule, and the name for northern Greenland, Thule, because that's where their underground base was. So Thule, Thoth, Enki have a big part to play in that period of Earth history. So here come the Federation. This is, at that time, it was primarily the Arcturians and the Andromedans. Today, the Galactic Federation is hundreds, if not thousands of cultures, but they were based even recently on a starship the size of France, about 600 kilometers across, triangular shaped, called Vieja, hidden on the other side of the moon. I think there's multiple sources on that. And that large Andromedan craft is where most of the Pleiadian craft, who had the biggest guns, who were here shooting out the Kingu reptilians underground, etc. So, but at that time in early solar system history, the reason the solar system almost blew up, and there's karma here, it's called nuclear karma, because the Federation tried so hard to blow out the Draco and Anunnaki from Earth and Mars that the nuclear blast, they used both nuclear and plasma weapons, took out the atmosphere on Mars and broke up the planet Tiamat, which was next out. It was mostly water. It fell apart, and that water is the Great Flood, literally. And there's many sources on this. And then the Earth orbit was destabilizing so bad that 500 years later, approximately, the Andromedans decided to install one of their almost dead artificial planetoids, hollow in metal, now called our moon, purposely to stabilize the orbit. And it's true, astronomers know that if the moon wasn't here, our orbit would fall apart in a big hurry. We'd be in trouble. And so Tiamat was functioning partially as that stabilizer, but then they had nuclear karma. So the interesting part of this story, having to do with the nukes, is inside that hollow metal Andromedan and Arcturian made moon, they installed a series of frequency generators, they were called the frequency fence, which they thought would trap the Draco and Anunnaki in the Earth, in the solar system, until they could come back and wipe them out, they thought. But first of all, how did that happen? You see, the hazardous radiation of the Van Allen belts was the big challenge for the good guys and the bad guys to get in and out of here. That's clear in the Sumerian translations. So they thought that the frequency generators in the moon would increase the density of the Van Allen belt radiation. It was a series of harmonic oscillators related to the Schumann harmonics, preventing implosion, quote unquote, closing stargates. And so what happened was that they thought that by making the Van Allen belts more dense, that the bad guys would be trapped here. And that worked for a while, but then there was nuclear karma. No, well, it has to do with the fact that during that time, they developed, and that is the bad guys and the good guys, developed what we call portal or Stargate technology. And to understand that, you need to understand the opposite of nuclear karma, which is if you get a broad spectral phase conjugator, example, Therify.net, that plasma system made broader spectral and made into higher flux density, guess what it is? As it is now, it induces lucid dreaming and higher flux density and broader power spectral phase conjugation. It is a Stargate. You know, when the first time you go through a Stargate, you think, oh, I was just lucid dreaming, as in Jodie Foster in Contact. And then the second time you go through a Stargate, that big dodeca, you think, oh, maybe it was more than a lucid dream. And then you came back from your lucid dream of a beach and you had sand on your feet. And you think, oh, maybe it was more than a lucid dream. So the story to the Maury is that after civilization develops access to stargates and portals, a wormhole, literally, then the quarantine doesn't work anymore. And that's the point at which the Galactic Federation said, okay, we got to give up on these worn out nuclear frequency generators inside the moon, and we have to release the Earth. And this is in the literature is related to the concept of the rapture, which is a time when the Earth can then reassume its true phase conjugate harmonics in implosive. And, you know, they say that the dead will rise, the dead will rise from the dead. What they mean is that the plasma of ghosts is released to be distributed. And it's true, actually, that in the time of the rapture, you know, the guns will melt. The reason the guns will melt is because everything that cannot do charge compression well will generate heat. That's the reason the guns will melt during the rapture. And it's also why the ancestors are raised from the dead, because plasma is enabled into distribution, otherwise known as heaven or planes of astral. Okay, so let's see where we are in the outlines. We talked about the Ark, the plague of Azoth. So later in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant was, they kept the weapons there, but also, you know, that spark gap. In fact, let's do one more screen share here now. And let's look at that picture of the Ark. I have Firefox. Yes, I think this is one. Logic fractality. Okay. Vacuum energy, origin of DNA. So let's see. Are you seeing a picture of the Ark? So this is the Fusion in the Blood article, and these are the links to the history of humanity there, the history of the moon and the history of man. This is the Pleiadian version, thanks to the interstellar mediator. This is the whole details of the story I just tried to tell briefly. But yeah, here is a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. You see these two wings here. Are you seeing a picture of the Ark? Yes? Okay.
Yes, sir. Yep.
So the two wings here are a spark gap. And in that spark gap, you have implosive capacitance, which is capable of stabilizing a gold monoatom in the monoatomic state because it's implosive, which is otherwise called Holy Communion or mono-ormes, the spice. So this was a mono generator, true, but this is also called the mercy seat because this is where the plasma could be stabilized to be inhabited by the plasma intelligences of the advanced ancestral beings. And inside, you could store nuclear devices without, well, with less radiation. Actually, if you listen to Graham Hancock visiting the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia today, you will see that the Ethiopian priest who's in charge of the Ark dies every couple of years because of nuclear karma. I mean, because of the plague of Azoth. I mean, because of radiation poisoning. And so the importance of understanding technology to contain the nukes is a recurrent story, not just in the Bible, but the extraterrestrial history of Earth. And that's why I wanted to tell that story. Okay, so now let's see, I'm checking my outline. Well, while I check my outline here, do we have any questions so far? Any thoughts, comments? How am I doing? Did I go too fast?
Not at all, at least for myself. Does anybody here want to jump in with any questions?
Yeah, I had a question with Tiamat. That's really interesting that the water from Tiamat caused a great flood. And I've heard that the asteroid belt is an exploded planet. Is that consistent? Is that the same?
Precise. That's exactly what they're saying, is that Tiamat was mostly water, and the smaller part of it that was not water is literally what now is the asteroid belt. Absolutely. And that rain of that water is the Great Flood story. I mean, there's lots of Great Flood, but the really big Great Flood is the water from Tiamat. That's what they're saying, yes. And there's multiple sources agreeing on that information, yeah. And so that is nuclear karma.
This, oh, sorry, Riel, please.
Nope, Dave, your turn.
I just wanted to ask, sir, this Orion Draco, human Draco war, that whole angle there, is this consistent with the alleged war that took place for hundreds of thousands of years? I think it was roughly 600,000 years, and there was never really an official winner on either side, per se?
Well, that would be true, that actually the Orion Wars have been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. It's true. There's a certain stability now, which was not present then. And that the increased stability now is due to the fact that the humanoids got their show together with this Galactic Federation, for example, and they now have the strength to limit the propagation of the Draco cultures from Orion and the other parasitic cultures. Again, I would recommend Elena Danan's book, Gift of the Stars, which has pictures of all the various different ET species, including the negative ones from Orion. But it's a big story, and we need to learn our place in that story. And our place in that story has to do with the power of genes that can make coherent aura, actually, literally the physics of ensoulment, which relates to graduating from nuclear karma. But yeah, no, those Orion Wars were 100,000. And now, for example, since literally more than 1,000 civilizations are represented in the Galactic Federation in this galaxy, which I believe they call Astara. And then there's a super galactic federation, which we used to call the Cedar cultures, or Kadistu, from we get our word Christ and Kiristu and Caduceus, the Kadistu cultures, as described by Anton Parks, and now as described by Elena Danaan. They have just arrived for the meetings on Ganymede because the graduation of the humans is so interesting. Like, now they're going to tell those humans that they're not the only species in the galaxy. Oh my God, they might get scared. Maybe they need to grow up. Maybe they need to learn about their nuclear karma. So actually, the point that, and Michael Salla has been very usefully at exopolitics.org, relaying Elena Danaan's reports from Thor Han and the Galactic Federation, and now the arrival of UMA with the Intergalactic Federation, which is here to witness the fact that the humanoids here have been released from their parasites, the Draco and the Greys, and they have now the opportunity to grow up, as it were, which is to assume their role in an interstellar culture. But that would imply that we would need to understand our nuclear karma, which, that's how this whole thing started. It was, you see, when Eisenhower met with I think it was the Tall Whites, who were representatives of the Federation, and they said, look, if you'll give up your nukes, we can do this and this and this, and we can take care of you. And then Eisenhower's advisors, particularly MJ-12, they said, oh, we can't give up our nukes because we have nuclear karma. And so then MJ-12 snuck behind Eisenhower's back. I think Laura Eisenhower, who's a friend, got that right, and that it really wasn't Eisenhower that screwed up so bad with the wrong treaty, with the wrong Greys, but it was the MJ-12 who snuck that in. And at that point, was when the large-scale abduction of humans began, looking for the lucid dreamers, because they have nuclear karma. They do not know how to make a soul. And the soul is the nucleus of life force, actually. So if you don't know how to make a soul, it means you got nuclear karma if you turn that inside out. So the fact is that they were looking for the lucid dreamers to do those abductions, because they were looking for the DNA recipe for Humpty Dumpty's egg, which is how to make a coherent aura, which is how to have a soul, which is how to take memory through death, which is the long-term memory that indicates the presence of a soul. And that long-term, long-wave memory is named longitudinal interferometry, or the ancestral grid, or songline dreaming track. It's a name for that longitudinal coherent field, which is a fractal field, obviously. And to be able to inhabit that grid means ensoulment, and it means you will have long-term memory. And the Dracos and Greys are very clear. They don't have long-term memory. They can't talk to their ancestors.
Right. Just two more quick questions. Sorry, I wanted to ask, and then Riel, if that's all right, then we'll continue. Majestic 12, is there any truth, at least relative to your understanding of MJ12 breaking off into two separate ideological factions? One of them wanting to align with the Dracos, and another one saying, listen, we need to just discover science for science sake and then worry about who we align with later. Any truth to that?
Well, obviously, all we pretty much have from that time period is rumors. But one of those rumors is the part of MJ12 that did not want to reveal the presence of the ETs and did not want to admit that they lost to the Nazis after Admiral Byrd got his ass kicked in the South Pole. Those are the ones that murdered James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, pushing him out of the top floor of his hospital, actually. Right. Just the day before his brother demanded they release him. And so that would be an indication, you're probably right, that there was a schism in the MJ12, and unfortunately the bad guys won.
And when you say Orion Draco war of many hundreds of thousands of years, when you say the word war, sir, are you saying kinetic war, spiritual war, strategic war, or all of the above?
I mean, that is
in your interpretation, in your humble opinion.
Yeah, that is obviously a big story and a big question. I mean, my Reverend Mother's group of indigenous elders in Western New York, when we were growing up, said, look up there, see the spiral arm of the galaxy, of our galaxy, called the Orion Arm. I've got a picture of this. And oh, that is the spiral arm that has the most breaking up in the middle of that spiral. You know, our galaxy, Milky Way, the spiral arms look pretty coherent, except there's a huge break in the Orion arm of the spiral, and that break, they said, that's the stars that we blew up. that's what I was told when I was growing up with the indigenous elders, actually. So the Orion Wars blew up probably hundreds, if not thousands, of stars. And there's many. The Hopi tell that story. The Pleiadians tell that story. Andromedans, they all tell that story, and the stories fit together. But it's
Thank you so much for that. We'll go Riel if you still have a question, and then we'll continue on.
Thanks. Yeah, wow. I love that we're talking about nuclear karma. That has been a topic that I first learned about from like David Wilcock doing his courses on Gaia TV, talking about the idea that souls that like beings that die from a nuclear explosion, they get basically some sort of like quantum entanglement, or it seems more like the opposite of that, where they have such bad karma that happens to them, they can never like ascend. Like, this is pretty much what we're talking about, right? Like the fact that the ETs are so interested in us because humans are using nuclear weapons to basically destroy the fabric of whatever we want. We used to call it space-time, but now I've learned from your lectures that's not an accurate term.
It's not a good word, but thank you for putting the nail on the head. Absolutely right. In fact, that's what we wanted to explain next in my conversation, was why it is that the EMF pulse of a nuclear device destroys not just the matter nearby, but destroys the network of plasma intelligence, which is ancestral memory, which is survival through death, which is the evolution of the next dimension, what we call 5D, or plasma intelligent being, which obviously the the advanced interstellar intelligences would include. So that's why they're so concerned about our nuclear karma. And what we wanted to talk about was what it is about a nuclear device that generates such a powerful EMF pulse that a component of it is a longitudinal wave that messes up plasma intelligences great distances away. That's the problem. That's the core issue. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great.
Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Yes. So, well, there was supposed to be a happily ever after to this conversation today, looking at my notes. The happily ever after was if we did understand the evolution of plasma intelligence, then we could understand how to graduate from schoolroom Earth and graduate from nuclear karma. And the way I entitled that part of the lecture notes, was the next part of the lecture, is it was saying fusion energy is the way up the ladder of dimensions, which is to say, if you think about it, think about the last time you had a bliss experience. You were sitting still, your aura was in good shape, you know, you had a stone circle or a circle of trees or some beautiful nature. You had an electric field relatively fractal in the array around you so that your aura could unpack. And then you were enjoying that stillness. There was a beautiful tingling quality of that stillness. And then suddenly there was some kind of big bang or something blew up or something messed up. And suddenly your aura felt like, even though the loud noise happened at a distance, it felt like it was inside your body. So when you have bliss and your aura unpacks into that radiance, in fact, what's happening is you're turning inside out, you're going within literally, and that implosion allows you to become centripetal and then inhabit that larger longitudinal array, literally the next dimension, which is called density, because in fact, there are more axes of spin symmetry in the more harmonic inclusive fractality of heart rate variability and brain waves. And the ratio of the superposed harmonics ideally is golden ratio, which you see in the harmonics of alpha, beta, gamma in your brain waves in golden ratio. That cascade increases in harmonic inclusiveness and harmonic density and spin density, thus enabling you to inhabit a bigger array. This is an introduction to the real psychophysics of what it means to say, go to the next dimension or become 5D, et cetera, all that. New Age woo-woo language is a very specific electrical language about inhabiting a larger array. And the life force that inhabits that array is a pulse geometry. We talked about it as a longitudinal EMF array, a fractal field, because when that pulse wave, which is longitudinal or compressional, goes to the next node, there's an exchange of inertia at every single node in that array. So everybody who lives at a node of fractal sacred space array of the Earth grid, for example, everyone joins the DNA radio at that point, and it becomes a big and potentially interstellar DNA radio. It's why at 9/11, when 3,000 people died, there was a dramatic change in the Earth's global capacitance. This is the Princeton Noosphere project. They measured the resonance by measuring the change in a random number generator. What they don't know is what changed the random number generator was a longitudinal wave of capacitance, of charge, actually. That's what caused the random number generator change in the Princeton Noosphere on the day of 9/11 when 3,000 people died. That's called DNA radio. And DNA radio requires the stability of the array. Otherwise, the radio don't work. This is why the Aboriginals call them dreaming track song lines, and they have to sing the right song, and why the Hopi had to sing the right song or the seed wouldn't grow, etc. And this is why the ancients used that array to enable successful birth and death. Because at the nodes of that array, yes, there was a change in nuclear critical mass, but more importantly, there was the presence of DNA radio ancestral memory. And as we've talked about this many times, as Kozyrev famously measured, actually, our friend Professor Korotkov did the measurements for Kozyrev, but when you put the Kozyrev mirror, which remember is just a microwave column tuned to DNA, basically it's a 1.91 angstrom ADP microwave harmonic, and that's the diameter of the metal tube called a Kozyrev mirror. And if you, before you locate the Kozyrev mirror, when you're looking for military grade telepathy, you have to make a magnetic map and find the cross point. And at the cross point, you get the military quality telepathy so well documented and measured by Korotkov. So what was that? That's because the longitudinal embedding at the array node is DNA radio, and therefore the physics of telepathy. The physics of telepathy, which is the introduction to action at a distance, is the coherence of longitudinal interferometry. And all of that stuff gets messed up if you got nuclear karma. It's just like kids unraveling, unraveling the nodes of their own nest. It's like the kids are taking, it's like the little birds taking apart their own nest and then falling out. It ain't pretty. Okay, so there was a couple of pictures that were supposed to go with the science part of this presentation, which are the keynote longitudinal compress. Let's see if we can do this here. Wait, no, we didn't finish the Firefox part this week. Okay, let's get those pictures from. Okay, so this is the review of the science. So you should be seeing the vacuum energy picture of equations. Now, are you seeing equations on the screen? Yeah, okay. And I'm not going to bore you with messy equations, but we're trying to now sort of do the science interlude. This is from fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. And this is our two published papers. On the left, how we proved the radii of hydrogen, golden ratio times Planck, prove the reason hydrogen makes gravity is because it's fractal. And then on the right, where we took the generalized wave equations, Navier-Stokes, etc., to prove golden ratio optimizes constructive wave interference and therefore is the generalized solution to compression. And once you know the generalized solution to compression, you then know the cause of gravity, because Einstein at least knew that much, that perfected infinite non-destructive compression is the name for gravity and the solution to unified field. So obviously, if you know how implosive non-destructive compression works, hint, golden ratio, then you know the cause of gravity, which Einstein didn't. So this is our paper on the cause of gravity. And the cause of gravity is the introduction to that nodal array. Hint, Gurdjieff insisted that planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically. What he meant was, this is introduction to DNA radio 101, why Jodie Foster had to use a dodecahedron to make contact. And this is a picture of how the vortex inhabit the dodecahedron, the harmonics of perfect embeddability, which are phase conjugate perfected. And that's the Planck threshold at the center, where the transverse wave embeds in a longitudinal wave, sometimes called the gravity wave. But the other pictures there are two other pictures to be shown here. This was the one of them. So just to say that the end of nuclear karma happens when our scientists learn why a vortex makes gravity. And by the way, we will learn why we lost to the Nazis the day we learn why a vortex makes gravity. Actually, this is a picture not just of Victor Schauberger, but this is a picture of the Mercury vortex, which was piezoelectrically doped with iron powder, the red, that was called Vimana Hanabu Nazi Bell. And so the fact that they could make gravity with a vortex was the difference between winning and losing. And so understanding how anything gets centripetal and makes gravity is the end of nuclear karma. And so this is all at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, which is my international lectures on the fact that every single 0-point energy device in history has always used the principle of phase conjugation, fractality, because that is in general how you cohere the vacuum. You become more fractal than the charge media, or than the ether. You become more fractal than the charge around you, and you implode charge, and that's called cohering the vacuum, or 0-point energy. And again, this is the core physics here. You've seen this many times, but the side view of the vortex that enables that, which is a view of everything dodecahedral, especially including hydrogen, that in that perfect vortex on that perfect cone, the side view of that perfect golden ratio vortex on the perfect 60-degree cone is the caduceus defined, which is phase conjugation defined. And at the threshold nose cone of the pine cone, which is the dimension of Planck, The transverse inertia coming in from the left is converted into longitudinal inertia, which is where the charge goes out through center, literally turning inside out our ET history. I mean, turning inside out the vortex, literally. You know, Einstein said you need infinite non-destructive compression. What he meant was there needs to be some place for the charge to go out the center when you pull the plug down the drain hole. Well, guess where it goes? The charge is accelerated through the speed of light, actually at golden mean ratio multiples times the speed of light. I refer to Professor Raymond Chow's measurement of speeds faster than light, dominated around golden ratio 1.62 times the speed of light, which is the second proof of our theory of gravity in addition to the radioactive hydrogen. So what's squirting out this squirt gun is a longitudinal or compressional wave, sometimes called a gravity wave. And in that array, inhabiting that fractality of that array is intelligence. Hello, mindfulness. That array, because so once we understand that plasma arrays become intelligent, then we can grow up and not need a body anymore. That'd be useful, don't you think? So this is all about the flameinmind.com golden ratio harmonics. Let's see, was there one more picture I wanted to show? Oh yeah, this was the birth canal. The golden ratio point of maximum pressure in the birth canal enables implosion during birth, literally the physics of successful rebirthing. But the picture I want to show here was Encke's picture. Just, you've seen that we talked about this physics, this is the Planck harmonics, revealing the frequencies of all negentropic systems, hydrogen, ADP. There's a lot here. But I had a picture of Encke here that I just thought would be fun. No, this is the vacuum emitter. Here's the Encke. So as we were talking about, this was the history of the origin of languages from Anton Parks, why the female and male languages. We talked about that in our other lecture, that the females and males had a separate language in Australia because the Draco had that, because of the war. The Orion Wars were a war of the sexes. And we talked about the Ark of the Covenant picture, and the Ark of the Covenant also was called showbread because they used there was a sulfur byproduct when the bioactive red algae converted the gold into an edible form called showbread, and you literally bake out the sulfur so the white gold powder becomes edible showbread. And the Ark of the Covenant had a role in that because it would stabilize the monoatomic gold, and they were eating the gold, obviously. Yeah, here's this, the plasma tubes, which are the logo for Therify.net, which are the age-reversing technology, the opposite of nuclear karma, which is depicted on the pyramid walls, which now is the physics of Therify.net, a negentropic, time-reversing, age-reversing plasma. And yeah, so this was the last picture I just wanted to chat about for a moment. Not to jump around too much here, but remember we said that Enki Sam Nudimmud, also named Osiris, has a green face on every statue in Egypt, and that he was essentially, you know, a reptilian. He looked rather like a frog. Well, he used a crystal here, not very well depicted, but this was what Anton Parks called a Girku. You could think of it as Enki's iPhone, but it was also called Ugur. It was called Silmarion by Thoth. It was called the Toy Stone or Fire Crystal by Edgar Casey. Later, there was a physicist named Sutton, whom I knew, who did a bunch of papers on the Atlantean fire crystal or Toy Stone. It was also called the Vril, which is a name for longitudinal interferometry, basically. And it was also called the fire crystal. And I worked with Louis Acker, who wrote the Handbook of Astrology, was my friend for years there. And he had a little too much LSD, but he had, his Atlantean memories really swept him, and he remembered being a priest in Atlantis using the fire crystal. And so we had a meeting with the Quartz Crystal Technologies of Western New York and actually worked on this physics. And later now, I can tell you that if you go to fractalfield.com/propulsion and read the book on crystal propulsion, which is the story of the famous Koski-Frost quartz crystal, it was a doped quartz crystal conjugated. And you pump a phase conjugate RF pump wave into this crystal, and they measured it at Bell and AT&T 800 times its weight in gravity, the Koski-Frost This was called warp propulsion. You know, the impulse drive was the mercury vortex, but the warp drive, that was, they called it the not barium titanate, but the lithium niobate. Well, they called it niobium, but it's actually lithium niobate, which is a phase conjugator. And basically, this is an introduction to something which I want to talk about here. The climax of this part of the story of the science is that once we learn how to use rotating conjugators to make zero-point energy and gravity, then we're ready to graduate. And an example of a rotating conjugator is when Keshe takes these rotating ping pong balls with nanomaterial inside, and they're spinning at high rates, and his car floats. Okay, they're making gravity. Unfortunately, Keshe doesn't understand the electrical engineering and does not have the capability to make the 99% pure nanomaterials like fullerenes necessary in quantity. But the proof of principle is there. That's an example of a rotating conjugator makes both energy and propulsion. A rotating conjugator, how to think about that. This is Buckminster fullerene. It was named for Bucky after Bucky died. I knew Bucky very well. And I don't think Bucky would have understood electrically. Bucky was a great architect, but electrically, no. But electrically, the reason Buckminster fullerene is the hottest subject in all of chemistry for decades is because in the center, you get negentropy. There is a 0 point. And if you rotate that conjugate, so basically, the way to think about that is in that Girku fire crystal that I showed you, the story is that Atlantis used them. There was a pump wave, and they used them for 0-point energy. It was a massive source of zero. So where is the conjugator that's rotating? Well, if you understand that the pump wave into the lithium niobate or barium titanate is an RF phase conjugate harmonic series, and the z-axis is helical, it rotates the conjugator. Now that's just an introduction, a clue to gravity making in solid state crystal technology. A very crude example of that would be the EM drive, which NASA doesn't understand why the EM drive makes gravity. But if you draw a picture of the microwave cascade in the EM drive trapezoidal, you get a phase conjugate implosive microwave cascade imploding through the 0 point, meaning you could tune that thing if you understood why an object falls to the ground. Unfortunately, NASA doesn't. Oops. Okay, so this was just a little tour through the physics of graduation from a trapped civilization, from the quarantine, needing to graduate from nuclear karma into becoming an interstellar community that's sophisticated enough to understand advanced technologies and inhabit the stars. Because you see, once we understand the physics of action at a distance, what we're calling action at a distance is the fact that this standing wave of pressure here, this node, can communicate with that one over there faster than the speed of light. It's measured and teachable with a longitudinal compressional wave. Then you begin to understand the passage of the cascade through those still point nodes, just like billiard balls that are touching each other, and you drop one and a billion billiard balls down the road bounces off immediately at the other end. Well, that transfer of information down that inhabited array is the beginning of the introduction to how advanced plasma intelligences, hint the 9, for example, they inhabit an array and they can show up anywhere they like, rather like Dave, when after 2001, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. In 2010, at the end of 2001, Dave says, oh, there's thousands of those dolmen in here, Dave. And it turns out it's a fractal array. And then he's so tempted to embed in that array that when the movie 2010 starts, he can inhabit anybody's TV set he wants to. Why do you suppose that is? Because he's inhabited the array Okay, the array was very attractive. He felt like embedding. It's like the Maid of the Mist, the Native American ancestor who died in Niagara Falls, and then she inhabits the ray and her spirit is present. So beginning to understand how arrays are inhabited, that compressional longitudinal array, and the fragility of that array and the necessary to restore the fractality, why every pyramid and dolmen on planet Earth practically is on a dodecaecosa node, they were inhabiting the array. So now we understand that graduating from nuclear karma requires understanding the physics of the cause of centripetal forces like gravity and mind and consciousness and life force, and it requires understanding the physics of inhabiting the array, literally how to graduate to the next dimension. So once we understand our nuclear karma and we unpack from fission to fusion, we can graduate to qualifying to be an interstellar culture. And that's what this lecture was rather about. So I hope there's any fun questions.
Well, first off, sir, thank you so very much. There are quite a handful of questions. This one comes from Dan. He says, if possible, could Mr. Winter share any thoughts on a palladium blanket and technology, blanket technology and its use?
Palladium is one of the platinum group metals seen atomically and clairvoyantly at the atomic level. It's clearly dodecahedral. You can see that in occult chemistry. So palladium is very magical. In fact, when we were in our friend Europe's leading cold fusion physicists, Jean-Paul Biberian's lab in Marseille, and he was showing us the palladium he was measuring for cold fusion. Valerie put it in her hand and she says, oh, it feels cool. It's cooling my hand. It's implosive. Oh, palladium is a magic array. So there is something to be said for a palladium blanket, which could probably be more expensive and maybe even more useful than a thin gold film blanket, which all the Chinese knew was of immense value. And of course, they would cut up the gold film and eat it on their cake. No, so, a phase conjugator like a thin film of palladium could have many uses. I would say that we are actively working on a synergy technology with Therify.net, which is the next step past a Lakhovsky coil inside a phase conjugating pair of healing blankets, actually. So there's a lot of usefulness to discussing the platinum group metals phase conjugate capacitance like palladium.
Thank you, sir. I very much appreciate it. Riel asks, and also I wanted to add to this, the 2 papers your team have published, how were they received by the mainstream scientific community? And if I could add to my end of that, particularly with people like Dr. Eric Davis, Jacques Vallée, having more and more legitimacy to their claims in the last couple of years, specifically, is there recognition from your work within quote unquote mainstream academia?
Well, it's interesting. I think more and more, I'm getting more evidence. I think it's academia. They send you all these notes of how many times you've been mentioned in references in the literature, and I'm getting a lot of those notes. So I think I am being quoted. But to be honest with you, I realized something early on here, which is that if you publish a breakthrough theory somewhere, don't expect people to care. But if suddenly people see that you made something commercial with it, then suddenly everyone cares.
Yeah.
So what we did, we took, the theory of what is negentropy, and we built flameandmind.com, theimploder.com, and Therify.net, and that attracted lots of attention. I'm grateful. So I think the key is you don't need to patent anything. I think that's messy. The military steals most of them anyway. But you build it and prove the principle with something you built, and that's what we're doing with gravity. We're going to prove the principle of how fractality causes gravity, and that will be commercial, and that will be an international group that will not be restricted by local governments.
Have you, sir, I ask with the utmost respect, have you been asked in any classified manner to consult on any programs? Because it's clear that, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that what people like Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon are leading to seems to parallel precisely with what you've been saying for years now. So clearly, obviously, you're on a very, very solidified path of discovering the truth. So could you comment on any consultations you may or may not have done?
Well, various companies. There's a group right now that's making something that you could call a med bed that suddenly got very interested in Therify.net doing rejuvenation. So I get inquiries every day, really. But recently, there's a group at the UN that just asked me to make presentations to a group at the UN, which I actually did years ago as well. So, there is some interest. But I would say, if you waited for governments and universities, you'd wait forever. But if you reach out to the grassroots and get a mass following of interest, which is basically an education mission, and that's where you really create momentum, and that's working very well.
Wow. Well, speaking of which, just two more questions, if that's all right. I've been meaning to ask you this for a couple weeks. A couple days after our second lecture, I had a new person sign up for our Patreon very graciously, and they did a one-on-one Zoom call with me, and they had told me, they gave me permission to share the story, that when it was a gentleman, a young guy, probably mid-20s, late 20s, him and his girlfriend had done psychedelics and mushrooms together, and they ended up having sex, and during specifically the climax of intercourse, they both saw, when speaking afterwards, they both saw a toroidal field when climaxing during sex, both of them. Is there any could you comment on that by chance? Is there anything going on in a sexual manner, spiritual manner, that may cause that?
Well, that's a rather beautiful story, and it's even romantic. We have been teaching about the physics of Tantra in parallel to Kundalini for years, and you know that our realheartcoherence.com originally was used to teach Tantra by teaching heart entrainment between the couple, obviously, and the physics of the orgasm, which is directly related to the physics of sacrocranial pump. The spine liquid wave mechanic of Kundalini is the same as the bliss of orgasm, and sexual juice conserved at the tailbone, what Gurdjieff called Kunda buffer, later becomes Kundalini, which we now know is actually the unfurling of the tip of the tailbone that functions as a straw. It literally sucks. And what it sucks is the microwave component ADP and the ultraviolet component of the sperm, of the spine liquid pump, which is the physics of Kundalini, drawing that implosion up to the high brain. And that creates a increasingly large toroidal magnetic field. And the whole point of Tantra and doing this as a couple is to increase the critical mass inertia of that field, so that one person has a harder time making bliss alone, but if they sit in a circle, they can reach the critical mass of bliss faster, and then eventually they can do it by themselves. But in the Gurdjieff school, clearly it was taught that if you want to feel your first bliss experience, your best chance is to have a group, actually. So yes, bliss has critical mass. It's absolutely electrically true. And to have the appropriate partner is a beautiful thing and romantic. And it's also true. Don't make sex with someone whom you don't want to have memories of them forever, because that is entanglement. So choose carefully. But given that is so, the ability to create that very large, gorgeous toroidal plasma field of bliss and orgasm, and then to use it as an organ of perception, that's a beautiful thing. That's an introduction to the beauty of sexuality.
Now, if I may ask, before our final question here, with respects to with that being a beautiful thing, to cover the opposite end of that spectrum, the angle of, again, people being molested and things like this, could you explain the science behind that angle of things? Is it just the opposite of what you just described of bliss? It's just the other end of it, so to speak?
Well, it's true that then any form of sexual abuse will be extremely difficult to get past, because it inhabits the core plasma body so deeply. And so the therapy to get past sexual abuse is a challenge. And by the way, they say that Therify plasma or other things like that is very good at helping induce deeper trance for getting through trauma and stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. But one would say that the way in which religion taught that sexual juice should be conserved had a germ of truth in the fact that if the sexual energies are conserved at the tailbone, for example, it can build the pressure necessary to have the implosion exponent of Kundalini up the spine, tailbone. But on the other hand, conserving sexual energy too much results in the freezing of the aura and the inability of the chakras to breathe, actually. So absolutely, just the conservation of sexual energy alone is a perverse thing. But understanding the beauty, that sexual energy is simple. It's your plasma wants a place to go. It's not
Right.
complicated. You see a beautiful person of the opposite sex, and your plasma says, "Oh, I'd like to inhabit that aura." Well, your aura is just saying, "I'd like to inhabit an array." It's a beautiful thing. It's nothing perverse about that.
Right.
So the urge to connect in terms of sexuality is simply your plasma field saying, "I'd like to grow up. I'd like to inhabit beauty." In this case, beauty is defined by fractality. So in the climax of that conversation might be to meditate on the ancient expression, which is, well, you only really fall in love with pure intention, which is to say, your aura is saying to you, I'm looking for somebody to steer my tornado. And
Right.
you're always looking for somebody whose intention is bigger than your intention. If your pure intention is bigger than my pure intention, then I need you to steer my tornado. That's why you fall in love with pure intention. The only sustainable love, actually. So what you're really looking for deep inside the other person's eyes is pure intention, which is literally the shareable wave, which ultimately will steer all tornadoes. And that's why
Well,
the king's daughter in the Grail story.
Okay, thank you. Because the reason I asked about the negative aspect was mainly because of at least from my perspective, the alleged Draco, manifestation of feeding off of energy of people by molesting them. That whole angle there. But thank you so much for that. Riel, a final question. Riel asks, when you were at the home of the nuclear physicist and he got the phone call about nanofilm that reduces radiation, was that real or were they trying to cover up? Did they actually have this technology? And is the radiation still poisoning the water and soil?
Many of my friends were involved in experiments with using thin film and conjugators to reduce radioactivity, and Cache was only one of them. And I do believe that was real, that thin film of Cache's nanomaterial is one example that you can use that to measurably reduce radioactivity on a small scale. But how do you do that on a global scale? Another friend of ours, John Hutchinson, had a frequency series. He used that for breaking up oil spills, but potentially could use that frequency series to reduce radioactivity. So implosive capacitance in general is the opposite of radioactivity. That is very true. Now, doing that on a global commercial scale, that's where you need to understand how conjugators work. There's an example that you could use sufficiently 99% pure carbon nanotubes would be one example, because they're massive conjugators. And the implications for water purification technology for the right carbon nanotubes is wonderful. And we do have teams on that.
I'm so sorry, sir, to add one more thing. You mentioned Mr. Hutchinson. I was just wondering, I don't mean, for you to speak on behalf of him or anything like this, but there's been a lot of speculation about, he discovered, certain things in his home, the military came, covered it all up. Is there any truth to any of those stories that have circulated?
I think the Canadian government at one point did interfere with John Hutchinson's experimenting lab there in Western Canada. His
Right.
partner, Nancy Lazarian, was trying to control things. And maybe still does. I don't know. I don't know them that well. They're very well intended, and I think you can use an implosive capacitance to make things float. And I think John Hutchinson demonstrated that on many occasions. I don't think he was ready to describe a generalized physics of how that worked, but he certainly had examples. And he used implosive capacitance beautifully to prove he could break up the oil spill in the Gulf at one point, and Nancy was with him. And it's true, I think the government, disassembled his lab on at least one occasion. They might have an environmental excuse for that. I don't know all the details, but it's true that many of these kinds of inventors have been interfered with governments, and that's a global phenomenon.
That could or may not tell people something, that you're on the right track and you're not. Yeah. Sorry, Nils, did you want to jump in with one final thing for Mr. Winter?
Yes, Mr. Winter, since you brought up John Hutchinson, I thought he disappeared in the early 90s. That's my last stance on that.
He was missing for a while, but then with Nancy there, they came back and kept doing experiments. I haven't talked to them recently. I think it's a year or two ago that I talked to Nancy and John. But he was a brave experimenter, and he was using high voltage implosive capacitance, and demonstrated a lot of things nicely. But generalizing that into a comprehensive theory of how these things work, that's what I've been looking at. But he worked with, I think, let's see, John Hathaway there in Toronto that I knew for years too. It's a long story.
It's all right.
Dan, you wanted to jump in? Sorry to keep you, sir. I keep saying last question. We're gonna have to make Dan's question the final one, guys. I don't mean to.
Hi, this is actually Vanity, Daniel's girlfriend. I just wanted to take this time and thank you, Dan, for just your gifts. And I wanted to let you know that I've used Therify 3 times, and I'm in contact with the Nashville Therify guy now, and he's going to make me deuterium depleted water now. And he recommended the palladium blanket. So I'm taking your guidance from the last time Daniel asked my question, and I'm usually at work for these calls. So I'm so blessed to just share this space with you all. So thank you.
Well, thank
I'm
you.
excited to see how this helps me reverse this type 1 diabetes.
Oh, I see. I think it's Dave there at the Therify Center in Nashville. So dedicated, works so hard. But if I may suggest, there are a fair number of other phase conjugate negentropic things that are profoundly synergetic with Therify, and the palladium blanket is one of them. But a couple others you might want to look into is the hydrogen nanobubble and breathing hydrogen, actually, because hydrogen is profoundly fractal. You need to do it right, but the devices. And the Ublicity, world's largest Therify center there in Las Vegas, is very knowledgeable on that. And also, there are certain infrared sauna where they use phase conjugate frequencies, and also, implosive water, water for the imploder.com, or water that's been zapped with Therify plasma. This is profoundly useful to things like skin issues and probably diabetes as well. So there's a fair number of things that add to the synergy of the implosive negentropy of Therify. And I'm glad you're benefiting by that. That network of global Therify practitioners is gaining momentum beautifully.
Well, sir, thank you so very much once again. It's been an honor and a pleasure to listen to your lecture and to be able to even ask you all these questions. And we are so grateful as always. And I think I speak on behalf of the people that aren't here as well in saying that we are grateful. So thank you so very much, sir.
Yeah, blessings, David. I enjoy working with your group. We always have fun. We'll see you again.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Blessings.
All right.